Hello, this is Freethought Forum, a program produced and funded by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Ralph Eisler.
Hello, I'm Joe Barnhart, and this is a show that's promoted by the scholarship, we hope, and science, and free of supernaturalism, which we call naturalism.
Yeah, so this is a call-in show. However, we only have one phone line. So if you can't get through, we invite you to tweet them to us at FFTVKNOX. Now, while we go over a few announcements, we invite you to start calling in now at the number on the screen. Get a pen and paper, and we'll give you our email address later in the show.
So the Atheist Society of Knoxville has a fun meeting at a place of eating and so forth. And tonight's meeting is at Barley's downtown in the Old City, starting at 5:30 today. Look for the silver jacket, the God Delusion, on the desk there somewhere. And if you plan to preach or proselytize or cause trouble, don't be there. But if you'd like to have good interchange of ideas and just enjoyment together, why, you sure would be welcome.
Sure we are. Okay, well, the Rationalists of East Tennessee have several regular monthly meetings. The first and third Sunday meetings are usually lectures with lively roundtable discussions. The book club meets on the second Sunday, and the Reflections group gets together for a potluck lunch on the fourth Sunday. Next Sunday's book discussion will feature Bart Ehrman's historical work on how Jesus became God.
Yeah, that's an interesting book.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can visit our website for additional details, including times and locations.
So Bart Ehrman's book is interesting. Also, we had Robert Price in town once.
Yeah.
His book, Killing History, which is a response to Bill O'Reilly's book on killing Jesus.
Yeah.
You can read O'Reilly's book. He's not a biblical scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but he's very, he says nothing exceedingly well, I think.
No, I don't think so.
No, you didn't get my point. He says nothing exceedingly well.
Okay.
He's very loquacious.
Yeah, all right. Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, so anyhow, today we're going to delve a little bit into how you do historical research, as opposed to, say, what O'Reilly and his co-worker have done, and just sort of taking things that are hearsay and putting them together and making a novel that would appeal to a lot of people to buy it. So anyhow, we'll discuss some of these points, but first we want to discuss one item that's in the news that I thought might be interesting to some of our viewers. And that is a former Seventh-day Adventist pastor who gave up religion for a year has now announced the existence of God seems like an extra layer of complexity that isn't necessary. In an interview with Religion News Service, Ryan Bell said he is speaking from a provisional conclusion, but that the intellectual and emotional energy it takes to figure out how God fits into everything is far greater than dealing with the reality as it presents itself to us. He goes on to say, I just say that the existence of God seems like an extra layer of complexity that isn't necessary. The world makes more sense to me as it is, without postulating a divine being who is somehow in charge of everything.
Well, that's what was interesting about the man is he does what a good scholar should do, and it's very difficult, is you get inside another frame of reference and try to think from that frame of reference. And it's risky.
Yeah.
Because you might learn something.
Yes, you might have to change your mind.
Looking back, I'm old enough, and you are too now. You can see what's happened to you sometimes, and to me several times as we make revisions. And this is what this minister did, and I think she should be encouraged and the church should be encouraged that it permitted a guy to do this somewhat.
Yeah. Well, you can give a little more info on him.
It went on with a year without God is part of what he was trying to speculate with, raising theological issues and struggling with his particular brand of religious faith.
Yeah.
And it was a struggle because he was trying to rethink.
Right. So what he did, he basically gave up praying or reading the Bible. He said he tried to live his life more or less as an atheist would.
Yeah. And he would read the Bible, but not just as inspiration. He would read it for historical analysis, and I like that about it.
Yeah.
Find out what was going on.
Yeah. So he put to read some atheist texts and visit gatherings of non-believers. He said, I'll do whatever I can to enter this world of atheism and live for a year as an atheist. He doesn't claim to be an atheist, but he at least went through that experience, and he blogged about his journey.
Yeah.
And it began with him losing 2 teaching jobs at institutions because of making this decision.
Yeah.
And it said in December to an NPR interview that he no longer identifies with Christianity, but he does feel atheism is an awkward fit, which I can understand.
Sure.
Just hasn't been able to get quite comfortable with it. In any case, I think one thing this does show is that when you live day to day with certain beliefs, you get reinforced, or they reinforce themselves with it, and that often impedes you looking outside. That area, that region. And in this case, it's very interesting that just sort of giving up that day-to-day contact, which I consider to be all in the mind with the God, that somehow those synapses didn't retain that type of commitment to the supernatural.
Your point is you're with a group, and all of us have groups, and groups reinforce what we're doing.
Sure.
That's why we're with it.
Right, exactly.
And if we're lucky, we try to have more than one group, because you get locked into a group, and then your brain might solidified.
Yes, and I think that's what happens to anybody if they get too involved with any particular group that has specific outlooks. I mean, you can go to a social group where people just have like conversation, things of that sort.
Yeah.
But if you're into a church group, or even into, say, a hardcore atheist group, you get those ideas firmly fixed in your mind oftentimes, and you tend to view almost everything that happens in those terms.
It's like putting on a pair of glasses and you can't see.
Yeah, pair of blinding. Right.
So that's one reason I like to read different. I'm sure you do too, and I know you do. You like to read different perspectives, and say, "Oh, I've never thought of that." And then you go back to another book you read, and you see the book you previously read in a different perspective, and so you compare them, and you hope you grow in that way. I remember telling my granddaughter, I said, I'm still learning. She said, you're 80-something. I said, well, I'm still learning. That was news to her.
That was news to her. She thought by now you knew everything.
Well, she's learned right away that I now she's challenging me.
Right.
That's good.
Well, she get the age. She's about 15, right?
Oh, yeah, that's like all right.
Okay, well, you were going to talk a little bit about how one should do historical research.
Yeah, this is a book I came across, I don't know, a couple of years ago. Maybe this is on looking into the life of Abraham Lincoln. A lot of Lincoln's life has some controversy about it. And in fact, one writer tried to argue, it was a homosexual trying to argue that Lincoln was homosexual, and he tried to build a case. Now, one critic says, well, the writer of that was biased. Well, I don't care whether a writer is biased or not. I want to know if he's doing good research.
Yeah.
To call somebody biased is irrelevant. You got to get down to the issues.
Yeah, yeah.
And this author challenges that, and I think he does a good job challenging the theory, and I think he makes a case better than the guy. But my point is, both of them are good scholars trying to make their cases.
Yes.
And my job is to try to, reading them is trying to make evaluations, and that's what I think historical inquiry is. is you say, okay, everybody's got biases or motives. One of the motives ought to be to try to find out what really happened.
Yes, I think for a historian that should be true.
Yeah, that's what I admire this writer. He shows how you can do this, and he quotes one and then he quotes another.
Mm-hmm.
Bart Ehrman is pretty good about that.
Yeah, Ehrman seems to be very good about that. There are problems that come up. For example, in Texas, which you're very familiar with.
Yeah.
Choosing textbooks in Texas is a problem. And we find a lot of revisionism so far as the history books.
Oh, yeah.
And particularly, I think it shows up in Texas. And unfortunately, they command such a large market in the textbook area that they influence what actually gets into the textbooks. And so I see them now trying to orient things historically so it looks like America was more of a Christian nation at its founding, you know, to re-emphasize that, or to give certain people other than Thomas Jefferson much more prominence because they don't like his views.
His viewpoints.
Yeah, exactly.
We even had one Baptist calling in that didn't like Roger Williams, who was
the Baptist.
Who came in through the Baptist tradition, had enormous influence on that, but he didn't like what this particular Baptist was doing. So,
yeah.
But anyhow, your point is, I think, is at undergraduate levels, you know, in high school and in middle school, that's real serious. In college, teachers often don't even use textbooks because you can have a variety of books.
Right, but what happens with, I mean, you know, children in grade school, that's where all this basis is really formed.
Yeah.
And so they often tend to pick up on the things that are taught there and hold on to them pretty much through life oftentimes if they don't go to college or get some broader experience in education.
Right. Maybe that's why logic should be taught in grammar school. They can learn it. They can learn it.
I think it absolutely should, that you don't have to make it real difficult, but you should, makes a start on how to think clearly and how to, you know, take two sides of a story and try to figure out which one is the closest to being correct.
That'd be a good experiment in teaching kids. To raise questions.
And I think that really should be done. As far as I can tell, that's not particularly done in grade school. You mostly try to make kids learn what we consider to be knowledge.
Yeah. And I remember looking back, I used to raise a lot of questions to my mother, and I think this is why I got to play outdoors a lot. I mean, she was very open-minded, but you know, she had to work.
Yeah.
But it's good to have kids. I was lucky to have teachers, I think, in middle school who just opened up new worlds.
Yeah.
And started us reading stuff that wasn't even a textbook. Just.
Oh yes, right. Yeah, if you have a course where you have to perhaps do a lot of library reading rather than straight out of the text that goes with the course, then that tends to expand your mind a lot, I think.
But I'd like to encourage some of our readers, if they're interested. This book on Lincoln gets into what real historical inquiry is and how difficult it is sometimes, because you got to get different sources in comparison, and that's why footnotes are important.
Oh yeah.
So you can trace out, well, where'd you get this kind of material?
Yeah, if you look at any good historical textbook, or you know, say one on Lincoln or whatever, you'll be just amazed at the number of references that are there in a well-researched book. I mean, I don't know how some of these people do it.
I know what you mean.
It's really tough, and of course, as we go along and grow older, the library behind us gets larger and larger. So there's much more to read.
I've got a 3-car garage, but most of it's books. And my wife says, "Where are we going to put our car?"
Yeah, yeah.
And I'd like to mention this book. We often think of the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian version of the New Testament. But this is an interesting little book about some of what's going on between the Testaments, called The Watchers, and about how notions of supernatural beings, and then they started speculating, if you got all these angels and supernatural beings, they got to be doing something. They just don't go around singing all the time.
I see.
And according to the Genesis chapter 6, the natural reading is that these angels got interested in human females. And then, of course, in the interbiblical period, some of those rabbis got to speculating about all these angels, and that's what's called this book is The Watchers. They were up there watching, and they started watching.
Started watching what was going on, and decided maybe they'd like to join in on a New Year's Eve party too, or something.
Some
because
of the human activity look interesting.
A little boring in heaven. Yeah.
Well, I remember asking an evangelical Christian once, or had one of my students ask him if there was going to be freedom in heaven. Actually, he'd written a book on the free will defense. We won't get into the free will issue right now. But his case was, and I can see what he was doing, is without freedom, and he was using that we aren't really fully human. You have to have choices and options and rational thinking and so forth. But that means, and his case was, well, we had freedom and we fell and did evil and all that. And that was his case, you see. And so I had the student to ask him, was there any free will in heaven or freedom in heaven? And I was just borrowing from John Milton, who had the notion that there were all these beings in heaven, and they got, they had envy, and they fell.
And they fell, yes.
So even if you're in, what kicked it off what you were saying, you're in heaven, you get bored, but John Milton had another idea.
Had another idea to keep them away from boredom.
Yeah, and that's what this book is really about. Those rabbis were saying, well, what do those guys up there in heaven do? And, they don't just, do anthems all the time.
Right, it can get pretty tiring.
Now, the book I'd like to mention is the sociology of early Christianity. And what these sociologists are trying to show is that Jesus and other people were poor at that time. In Galilee, in fact, Galilee is mostly farmers. And they got taxed heavily by the Roman government, and they got to send money down to the priests to take in animals. And animals cost money that they got to slaughter. And so Jesus represents a rather lower level of the community. And so when he says, blessed are the poor, that meant something. And he was saying, we are somebody, don't forget.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And in their case, is that the revolt against the law was basically the abuse of the law being made at that time. That all cultures have to have laws.
Yeah, when you say revolt against the law, exactly.
Well, the law of Moses, the Torah.
There was a revolt against it.
Yeah, well, Paul talks about law, the Torah as slavery. Now, here's a Jew talking about the law of Moses as slavery. How does that come about? The sociologists and others are trying to say, well, they had some good laws, against stealing, and they were good laws. But then they got.
I think we have a caller here.
Yeah, let's go.
Hello, caller. Can you hear us?
I'm hearing you loud and clear.
Okay. Could we have a name or a nickname?
Sure enough. This is Faithless Forest. I've been watching the show. And earlier, Joe had shown the book, the biographical book, I guess, about Abraham Lincoln. And I guess I thought that you might talk about, the religious references Lincoln made in, his speeches and his addresses. I think they're often used to try and claim that here's yet another great American president who is strongly religious, or exclusively religious, let's say. And certainly I think as a candidate for president, he gave speeches where he used the phrase "a house divided against itself cannot stand."
Yes.
That was and his second inaugural address, talked about how that the nation is both sides appeal to the same God, and yet, obviously both can't be right. And so a lot of religious references there. Did the author of that book address the religiosity of Abraham Lincoln, or was he mostly trying to make an argument about a sexual orientation?
Well, he got into several things, but he didn't get too much into his religion. There are, of course, a number of books on Lincoln's religion. His religion was in great controversy during his life. I don't think you could make a case that Lincoln went too much for supernaturalism. He recognized the difficulties of it, and it's very doubtful that he held to the deity of a Jesus. And of course, as a politician at that time, you can't be, if you're going to talk religion and politics, you want to be general, but if you start getting really specific, then you're going to alienate.
Yes, that hasn't changed.
That hasn't changed at all.
And
it's okay to say God, but don't get too definite.
Right.
Otherwise, you're going to say, well, that's not the version we believe in.
Yes. The role of the politician is to avoid alienating as many people as possible, and in order to get elected. Okay.
If you're going to get elected, you need
that. That's why many of them don't say anything of substance, because they're bound to antagonize some group.
Well, and they have a point. The way to deal with a theory is to try to make it more and more specific. But that's how you refute a theory.
Yes.
If you keep it vague, it can't be refuted.
Exactly.
But you don't make any progress that way.
No, you don't.
Say yes, that which cannot be refuted is almost worthless.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Right.
So anyhow, but we had this one point which you alluded to a little bit, that both sides in the Civil War claimed that God supported them, or the Bible supported them. And that brings up a point, maybe in contrasting Ehrman's book with O'Reilly's book, that I firmly believe that nobody derives their morals or ethics from the religion. They decide what they are, and then they use the religion to justify whatever they've decided. So if you're going to decide to hate a certain group of people, say blacks in the pre-bellum, pre-Civil War era, you can use your religion to justify it. And if you're going to want to get rid of slavery, you can use the same religion to justify it.
So religion becomes the search to justify that which you want to do.
Yeah.
That's how the Bible is a mind to find something that supports what you've already decided you want to do.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I don't think that's all there is to religion, but I think that religion is like scissors. Scissors can be useful for different things, one of which is you can stab somebody.
All right.
Otherwise, you can make a suit of clothes, or you can help make a suit of clothes.
Yeah,
it's very useful.
That's probably a discussion for another time.
Another
I wanted
issue,
to throw this in.
I'll let
any
you get
case.
back into discussing history and research.
Okay, well, thanks very much for calling in for us.
Here's another book I think would be very interesting for our audience. It's From Jesus to Christ by Paula Fredrickson. Which is very similar to Bart Ehrman's book. In fact, the University of Tennessee had both people here to speak at different times. And she's making a case similar to Bart's. Now, Bart thinks Jesus did not regard himself as a divine or as God.
Right.
And it is an interesting thing. When did the early Christians regard him as God? By the time you get to the Nicene Creed about 315 and then the Chalcedonian later, you have the statement Jesus is fully God and fully man.
Yes, well, that's another thing that's not often talked about in churches, and that is how much dissension there was among the early Christians on these points.
Very good, yeah. You had the Monophysites, and that's mono means one, and physis mean one nature. Mm-hmm. And then you had others that Jesus has two natures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they had a big split. That was at least in the 2nd century.
Yeah.
The 2nd century.
Well, the interesting thing about Ehrman's book is that he discusses how in the ancient world how people became gods. Okay, and one way was for a god to come down to earth and take a human form. Mm-hmm. Okay, mm-hmm. And then later, of course, that guy disappeared and he'd be God. The other was that gods interacted with humans to beget what should I call it, a crossbreed or something of this sort, in a way. And the third was that somebody who was born human could be elevated to divine status, as the Roman emperors did later. Under Octavian, he decided he was going to be God while he was alive. Caesar may have been made a god after he died. But Octavian decided he wanted that godship while he was still living.
That's quite a promotion.
Quite a promotion.
Got to live up to that, though.
Yeah, yeah. And so he also makes the point that while we see or tend to see a division between the natural and supernatural in our current lifetime, that the ancients didn't so much.
That's a good point.
In a way,
they blended them.
Kind of blended together, and I myself don't know exactly how to think about that. I mean, I realize that modern day Christians think that they are going to live forever, and they don't see difference don't make a great distinction between the natural and supernatural.
When I remember as a kid thinking about that, I'd go to heaven, let's say, now, and I heard preachers say, then you'll understand it all.
Yeah.
Well, now, what does that mean, to understand it all? I mean, the more I went to school, the more, that's a lot to understand. Yeah. You're going to know everything as soon as you get to heaven, or you're going to get now, I'd have to have eternity. There's so much to know.
Yeah.
So is there a learning process? Or do you just know it all?
Do you just suddenly know it all, huh?
And then there was a question, and when Jesus was on earth, you see, that some of the Christians raised the question among themselves, did Jesus know it all? And if so, when? When he was 2 years old?
Yeah, what did he know? When did he know it?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that's I think that's a valid question if you believe that he was, part of the Godhead to begin with, something of this sort. But
well, part of the thinking is getting inside a framework and see where it goes, and that's how you usually modify it.
Yeah.
But you've been doing that all your life, haven't you?
Pretty much so. I mean. I'm a physicist, and so you can't stop learning. I mean, you have to keep going on. That's what the business is about.
A good physicist sometimes try to shoot down his own theory?
Reluctantly, but it has happened, and I can give you examples, but I won't bother right now. So anyhow. Just remind our audience here that in case you're just tuning in, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. Shows are live most every Tuesday from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern on community television. You can also see it streaming online outside of Knoxville area. Just go to ctvknox.org.
.org,
Okay, and so...
we have a caller coming in, I think.
Oh, do we have a call coming in?
Let's go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a caller?
Yes.
Oh, good. Let's hear what you had to tell us. Go ahead.
Well, there was just a couple of points that you mentioned. I hoped I might be able to help out on. Bill O'Reilly's book, you're absolutely right. That's a travesty. It's a terrible, terrible book. I happened to pick it up in the library, in the bookstore, and read some of it. Is going into long, drawn-out detail about the massacre of the innocents without ever a footnote of how he got all of these fantastic details, except to note that God told him to write the book. There's a lot of people on Fox that political views and books and all are inspired by God. Bless their hearts.
Yeah.
Also, I was going to mention that you had a question about about the Lincoln. I have no inkling whether he was gay or not. I don't think that really comes into anything. But,
no, I don't think he was.
But his his biographer who lived with him in Washington and also knew him in Illinois said he never said anything or wrote anything that he had the slightest bit of inkling of any sort of faith in Jesus. And his own biographer depicted him as a deist or skeptical. Most of our really wonderful forefathers were deists. And but I just want to mention that. And also you mentioned free thought, or rather freedom or free will in heaven. And I've thought about that too. And I'm glad you mentioned it, because the way I look at it is there's going to be no sadness in heaven. Also going to be no marriage, so there'll be no sex. Well, as a matter of fact, Mark Twain said heaven was filled with the things that we really hated on earth, like going to church and singing and dressing up in uncomfortable clothes. But St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas
Go ahead.
said that one of the joys in heaven, or one of the things you could do in heaven, was to look down at hell and witness the suffering of the tortured down there. And the way I figure it, if you can watch people being tortured and not be sad, then you're probably under mind control.
Well, would you say that tells us not anything about theology, but it tells us a heck of a lot about Thomas Aquinas?
Well, wasn't he a really, really big theologian?
Well, yeah. He was a major
saint.
He was a major theologian.
Right.
Died, I think, about 1274. I've forgotten what time.
Yeah, well, if I would imagine it tells us something about religion. If he's an expert on religion, I have to look to those sort of experts for that kind of stuff.
Well, I don't want to generalize from him, but I'm just saying that comment tells us a lot about him.
About how he could enjoy people being tortured.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah, he'd probably make a good Republican today.
Well, I don't want to generalize about. I don't want to get in the habit of generalizing. That's
I just kid. My Republican friends know I think they're really scum, so they're just kidding.
Okay.
More kidding. Anyway, I'll get off and let you go. I just wanted to make those comments.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, caller.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I didn't want to get off onto the politics.
No, I think we're going to kind of avoid that. Should we play our promotionals now for our supporters here? Let our audience
if we
see who is giving us the money to produce this program.
Knoxville area and are questioning your religious beliefs, or simply believe in one less God than everyone else? Well, you're not alone. The Atheist Society of Knoxville is a fun and friendly group of people just like you that meets twice a week at a bar or restaurant. We meet every Tuesday night following the show at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria for happy hour. You'll find our group either inside or on the patio. Look for Richard Dawkins' silver-jacketed book, The God Delusion, standing upright on the table. On Fridays, we meet at Agave Azul or the Beard and Beer Market. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't. We all question what we believe at one point in our lives. If this is the time for you, come join us for food, drink, conversation, and fun. Do you find stories of talking snakes laughable? Do you prefer the scientific method over supernatural beliefs? Are you concerned about religious leaders and organizations imposing their values and rules on your body, your family, and the rest of our society? Well, take comfort in the fact that you're not alone. The Rationalists of East Tennessee meets weekly for fellowship and provides a forum for people who support skeptical thinking and rational discussion of these and other issues. To find out more information or to find out about our next meeting, visit us on the web at www.rationalist.org.
Okay, well, here we are back talking about how one does historical research, and I think we're going to go a little bit into what the actual history may have been of some of the early Christian church here. And we had some ideas about how Peter, James, and Paul interacted.
Oh boy! Well, if you take Paul's viewpoint, and particularly in Galatians, there was a pretty hard. He gets very sarcastic, calls them the so-called pillars. That's pretty. And he makes clear that he is second to none of them. And he's emphasizing he had his own special revelations and went to the third heaven.
Right, but he never knew Jesus.
There is no evidence at all that he had ever seen the historical Jesus or heard. In fact, I think I mentioned on this program, Albert Schweitzer, who wrote an exceedingly good book on Jesus and then another book on Paul, says that when you would have expected Paul to refer to the teachings and the parables of Jesus, you can't find them.
Right.
Now that's a dead giveaway. And when Paul differs with James and Peter, they're in Galatians, 1st and 2nd chapter, neither one of them is quoting Jesus. I think that's really suspect. Why? It seems to me if Jesus said something on this issue, say of circumcision or something else, a Sabbath or anything, one of them could have quoted Jesus and Paul could have. And by the time you get to the book of Acts, which may be around toward the end of the 1st century, you have to have Peter going up on a housetop and having a trance, and Jesus from heaven, this is supposed to be the Jesus he walked with daily.
Yeah.
Apparently he didn't get anything while he was on earth. He has to get so-called vision, and that vision just happens to make him finally agree with Paul's viewpoint.
Oh,
and
really?
Most scholars think what that is this writer of the book of Acts was very strong toward Paul's view, and he simply created this out of nothing.
Right.
To make the Peter clan and group.
Right. So historically, it's not something that one thinks is very reliable because it doesn't fit with the rest of the history that you find.
Now, to be fair to Peter, earlier Paul had claimed he went up to the third heaven and got his particular views of Jesus. Even the notion of Paul does refer what happened at the Last Supper.
Yeah.
But he doesn't say he got the information from Peter or from Andrew or Bartholomew or anybody supposedly who was there.
Yeah.
He claims he got it from the third heaven.
Okay, well, I think we can all make such claims, and I think there are people who have done so in our lifetime, actually.
Yes.
And but this brings up the two views of Jesus that perhaps are even discussed a lot today, and that is, was he a human who just eventually got promoted to be divine, say from Peter and James' point of view, or was he someone who was already divine, Paul's point of view, and the later writings, the Gospels, try to give him a human history, because there are a lot of people who think that you know, Paul may have been a Gnostic, may have been one of these people who was just sort of entranced by the ideas of God of some sort or another, and that Jesus wasn't a real person to him. He was a God figure. And I don't know how many
well, in Philippians,
people would buy that or not, but
in Philippians 2, he does say that he came to earth and as a human and died unto death. He wants to emphasize them. In fact, he once said he preached only Christ and him crucified.
Yes.
That's a major theme
yes,
of Paul. Not the teachings of Jesus.
right,
The
exactly.
death and the resurrection, particularly crucifixion, because he thinks is an atonement.
Right, and and in fact, he seems to know nothing about Jesus' human life.
No,
nothing
no,
about
there's
Jesus'
no
early
evidence at
life.
all that he did. No evidence.
And so later, the later Christians who came along and wrote the Gospels, which were written after
Paul.
tried to go back and fill in that history, supposedly.
Yeah, Mark seems to be borrowing heavily from Paul, but trying to fill it in. But when he gets to the resurrection, he just cuts it off.
Yeah, but
finds
even
an empty tomb, but that's it. Nobody
Right.
knows what happened or.
no, but even Mark, he doesn't. He starts with Jesus as a fully grown man,
Yeah, exactly.
to be baptized.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. No virgin birth or anything.
No virgin birth, no childhood, no kid in the temple lecturing to the priest there at all.
It gets all filled in later.
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me, what do you think? You would think you would have some information, some details about Joseph. I mean, here's a father.
Yeah.
But he just gets shoved to the background, and you do have the one case in which it apparently the family of Jesus, when he's a grown man, think he's out of his mind,
Yeah.
and they want him to take him home. Why would they think he's nuts? Well, it could have been some things he was saying.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like maybe he was going to be having these 12 guys, and they were going to have a kingdom.
Yeah.
And he was going to point them as, and that is a little, if you look at it from a Paris point of view,
Yeah.
the guy's a little screwy.
I would think it quite strange.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Joseph sort of is like one of these spear carriers in an opera, right? You just stand there, and all the action goes on around you.
Yeah. Now, whether or not that actually happened, that's one of the problems we've been trying to raise in this program, is we don't know for sure what the historical Jesus was like. There are some, I think Bart Ehrman and Paula Fredrickson and people like G.A. Wells and other good scholars have tried to piece together, and the Jesus Seminar Group, these are very good scholars from Protestant and Catholic background and other backgrounds.
Yeah.
They work together, trying to say, what was this guy like? And they have some differences among themselves.
Oh, I know.
And I respect them all. I mean, I can see why one would say this. It makes sense, but on the other hand, then there's a lot of my wife says that there's an octopus there. On the other hand, you've got about 8 other hands. And
yeah, well, that's a good point. I mean, these people have spent a large part of their lives trying to tease out of the Bible what they think is historically accurate, or what were the actual words of Jesus. Taking everything that's written in the Bible and trying to decide what he might have actually said and what the writers may have put in his mouth when he wrote it.
We have good reason to believe that the ancient Greeks often put words into their heroes' mouths.
Yeah, oh sure.
And what's interesting, basically got to the story of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus after Jesus presumably, I think this is about Luke chapter 22, somewhere around there. The two disciples meet Jesus along the road, and they don't even know who he is.
Yes.
Now, presumably they were disciples, had been with him. Now, did he go through a facelift? Did they not recognize his voice? And, well, I think this is taken from some of the old Greek stories in which the gods come incognito.
Yes.
And they appear among human beings, and I think it's the same kind of
could well be.
Story.
Could well be.
It's not in the Gospel of John, or just that one story.
No, and that's that again is a point that I think Ehrman makes in his book, that as you go along, as these various things were written that are in the Bible, the various books are written in the Bible, and go farther and farther in history until you might have Mark written as early as 35 years after Jesus' death, and then John maybe at 100 in the CE, something like that.
John is usually thought to be toward the end of the century.
Yeah.
And by the time you get to John, Jesus is the Logos.
Right.
That's translated word in archaic, ein ho Logos. In the beginning was the Logos. And that's a translation of the Greek, Sophia means wisdom. And here's wisdom coming to earth. Now, it doesn't say, even John doesn't say that Jesus was fully up there.
Right.
It's just Logos came to earth. And then it's a way, in some ways you could say this is what Plato is doing with Socrates. Let me take the word philosophy. Philos. Love
of learning.
Sophia.
Knowledge.
And it's the same idea.
Right.
And Plato is trying to say here with Socrates, you have a kind of walking wisdom. That's what he's trying to. Now, he's not making Socrates a divine being.
No.
But I think the fourth gospel is doing a similar thing. And here you have now a Jesus figure, and then Logos, kind of a wisdom character.
Yeah.
Like the Greeks had.
But as Ehrman would say, he probably did not become fully God until 200-300 years after his life.
Exactly. The fourth gospel doesn't say he was God up there.
No.
This is just wisdom.
Yeah. And so I actually reading about some of the fights of the early church and all the throes that they went through until they finally settled on an orthodoxy is kind of interesting.
It is
in
interesting,
itself.
isn't it?
And we do probably have better historical records of some of that than we do of the time of Jesus himself.
Well, one of the problems they were dealing with is if Jesus was God, as we mentioned earlier, when? And then the Gospel of Mark is he gets made the Son of God at baptism.
Yes, but that's, whether that's a euphemism,
what that means exactly.
What are blessed are the meek, for they should be called the children of God, or whatever. So
good point. Many children of God.
So whether that is something very specific or kind of generalization like that, I've never been sure.
Well, he started off as a disciple of John the Baptist, and one of the embarrassing things of later Orthodoxy, John the Baptist, he was baptized by John.
Yeah.
John says, repent and be baptized. Now, is Jesus coming in repenting? And if so, that's different from later Orthodoxy. It says he was born perfect and stayed perfect all the way through.
Of course.
So, and then if he's fully human, that doesn't sound fully human to me. If he's
okay, I don't want to get tangled up in those because I actually find these theological discussions to be awfully annoying. I mean, we could discuss the history and everything like that, but...
Well, the reason they're interesting to me is, as a humanist, I want to see, I don't want to get into ethnocentrism. If I go to another culture, they're greatly different from me. That doesn't mean they're insane or stupid and don't solve problems. I want to see how they use their material to solve their problem. That's why the Apostle Paul is interesting to me. He is taking his frame of reference and then dealing with the problem that every culture has is grace and forgiveness and justice. Every culture's got to deal with that.
Well, why do you have to deal with forgiveness? I mean, I don't really I don't understand the concept of sinning very well.
Okay, let's don't use the word.
Okay.
That's a knee-jerk word, right?
Yeah.
Okay. You and I know you've done things wrong. Okay? That's your perfect.
Yeah, I thought I was.
Okay.
I'm just sure, we've all done some things we probably regret in our lifetimes, of course.
And all forgiveness means demythologize it. See, demythologize. It's a normal, everyday thing. Is you're back in the good graces of your community. In other words, if I do you dirt, and I really can't pay you back because it's so bad what I did to you, then the question is, are you going to accept me back into the community so you can relate to me again? Or are you going to say, okay, Barnhart, spend the rest of your life paying for it?
Okay, right. I understand that from the point of view of forgiveness in that context.
Yeah, that's all it is.
Okay.
It's simply acceptance of each other despite our weaknesses, but we've got to have evidence that we're not going to repeat it.
Yeah.
And I think that should be translated into the penal system so that we don't make a growing industry of keeping people in jail just because we got people there who make money off of it.
Well, yeah, that's another scandal of our time, which might be worth discussing at some point.
I think that's exactly what Paul was dealing with in his time.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, when he's talking about the Torah and grace and forgiveness. See, what I'm saying is, forget their theological thing right now. They're taking their theological language, but they're nevertheless trying to deal with real, practical human problems and how to solve them. And I learned a lot from the Apostle Paul because it seemed to me he worked through this problem rather ingeniously. Well,
I've always had the view that, and you can correct me on this, that Paul really wanted to convert the Jews to what I would call Christianity or some form of it then. He wanted them to accept Jesus as the Messiah. And he just failed in doing that. And so he found fertile ground among the Gentiles more so.
Okay, part of the Jews.
So he just kind of didn't make out in that Jewish tradition, and he went elsewhere, as a good entrepreneur would.
I look at it a different way.
Okay.
He is a Jew, but the Jews already, before Paul, already were making inroads into the Gentile community. I mean, they had Jews all over the empire.
Oh, sure.
And they had, I don't like the phrase, but I like the idea, forget the word, the God-fearers. Now, look at what that really means. They had people who didn't go through all the circumcisions, they didn't become Jews, but nevertheless they knew what the moral code was in that monotheism. And they were part of the temple. They could come in as Gentiles. And I think this is where Paul is coming from when he says he's a Pharisee. The Pharisees were the liberal parts.
Yeah, right.
No, not the Sadducees.
Not the Sadducees.
And he's simply extending this and saying we can carry this on and make now the Gentiles a part of the Abrahamic covenant.
Yes, but the people who wanted to stay more closely identified with Judaism were not too happy with that, as I understand.
You're right, James and Peter.
Right.
And that circumcision, and there was a group coming up from Jerusalem under the guidance, presumably, of James, wanting some of these Christians, or these people coming in, to maintain circumcision as maybe a requirement, at least for Jewish. And that's what really, that Paul called them hypocrites. I mean, he was really, and when you look at his language, he calls them false brethren, and he's angry. You can tell.
Oh, yeah.
And he says, the reason he's angry is he says, I'm trying to open up this, and you're saying now let's close it all and turn them into.
Right.
And you can see in the history of Judaism, you had Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. They got the same problem.
And Paul's trying to get rid of ritual as a foundation for the religion in some sense.
And look at even his notion of Jesus as an atoning sacrifice. Now, here's a Jew already knowing that child sacrifice is wrong. So why in the world is he coming up with this notion that Jesus is a sacrifice to cover sin? I think what he's doing is he's eliminating the whole priestly system. Now that's a radical thing. We don't need the priests. Furthermore, we don't need all these animals coming in.
Oh, that's an interesting idea.
In short, he is saying we can keep the monotheism, we can keep the concept of grace and forgiveness and interrelations without all this, you mentioned the word ritual. We don't need all of these kinds of rituals, which the priests got control of.
Yeah.
And by the time you get to the general epistles, the Peter and James, you have one of the apostles saying that we are a holy priesthood. That means every believer is his own priest. Now you talk about, see, what I'm saying is studying this from a sociological point of view, these are radicals. They're using their language and their ideology because that's all they had. They didn't have Galileo, and they didn't have Copernicus.
No.
So they were living in their framework, and they were trying to say, how are we going to solve these miserable things of being dominated by this priestly class, having all these animals we got to sacrifice. We need to be released from all of this. And that's why I think Christianity spread. And what's the ingenious thing, instead of having the emperor being divine, they got a poor man and promoted him to divinity. I think it's ingenious.
Yeah, well,
you don't have to buy it, but you can see they knew how to operate.
Well, that certainly was an attraction for the common person.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I think we've had a little discussion here. There's a lot more we could on the bit, but it's about time to close up here now. We've only got about a minute to go, so it's time to start wrapping things up. Get out your pen and paper.
It's been the Freethought Forum, a program by the Rationalists of East Tennessee and the Atheist Society of Knoxville.
Please send us feedback. You can leave voicemail at 865-272-9060, or you can email us at freethoughtforum@yahoo.com.
And at 5 o'clock on Tuesdays, we're always with you and hope you'll be with us. Thank you.
That's down at Barley's, down in the Old City. No matter what your point of view, as Joe said, so long as you don't punch or kick or use bad language, why we're happy to have anybody there. So our thanks to Sam and Jonas for technical help, and to the staff at CTV Knox, and to all of our callers.